Hi, guys. Thanks for coming back onto the podcast.
Thanks for having us, Andy.
Two very familiar faces. Obviously, our community and partner architects. Great to have you guys back. I want to have a conversation about future proofing today. I want to talk about, in the context of all of the regulatory changes, all these additional pressures, I think the big squeeze on private landlords, and let's be frank, the fact that tenants have just got more of that power, they've got more rights. Talk about how we can operate our HMOs, how we can plan better from the very initial stages to make sure that we're future proofing our assets and our investments as well as possible. I wanted to have this conversation with you guys from a very technical perspective as well. So let's start today by just talking about what your opinions are about some of the potential challenges in, I suppose, the fabric of our houses that we might need to start thinking a lot more about given the new legislation. I mean, I know that you guys are doing a lot of projects for our community, but it'd be great to hear what your thoughts are in terms of the sort of things that we need to start paying more attention to right now.
Yeah, definitely. I think, as everyone knows, there's a lot of legislation hoops to jump through already with planning, building regs, licensing, amenity standards. But as we know with the Renters' Rights Act coming in, there's going to always be another layer of that on top. Renters are going to have more powers to challenge things. HMO officers are going to have more ability to request changes, etc. And we've seen this with a friend recently who's had a HMO inspector come in and put a damp meter on every property of the wall, and where the meter reading deemed to be too high, they're having to do remedial damp works to the property. So there's going to be more red tape to jump through. I think it's therefore making it even more imperative that, a lot of people are making incredible products and spending a lot of money on their refurbs, and you want to make sure that you're getting it right from the outset at the beginning, to kind of, as we said, future-proof your properties further down the line.
I want to add a bit of context from personal experience to this as well, because I think what we're talking about really is, well, two things. First of all, we need to perhaps better consider any work that we are doing to our properties now in terms of the fabric of the design, ventilation, heating solutions, that sort of stuff. But I also think there's an additional piece that we need to think about very seriously, which is defensibility. And I think that that's one thing that over the years, a lot of landlords have paid very little attention to. And just from personal experience, I'm going to just share a recent story. I've got a block of flats, and in this particular block of flats, I had this a particular lady who turned out to be quite a difficult tenant. Anyway, we went through the rigmarole of removing her, not before she managed to accrue quite substantial arrears, many, many, many thousands of pounds. And as part of her, I suppose, best effort to try and deflect, the pressure from us to pay the rent or come up with some sort of payment plan, this particular tenant tried to use everything that she could possibly think of to justify offsetting her rent and justify that she was due some sort of compensation back. And it was in the form of damp, mold, disrepair, ventilation, just everything. And it came in two different forms. Well, it came in three different forms. First of all, it was through the agent, just being quite difficult with us. Secondly, it came in the form of a housing standards complaint and then an inspection from the local authority. And it also came in the form of two letters from solicitors, one of which was a personal injury claim for the consequences of mold and things like that. Now, I can tell you quite confidently that they didn't go anywhere at all. There's quite a sort of checkered history with this tenant, but it made our lives as landlords very, very difficult. And you can imagine the amount of time spent over months trying to not only just chase the rent, but then, having to speak to my insurer, disclose that somebody's made a personal injury claim against us and all of this stuff. The response to the personal injury claim was sort of 30 or 40 pages long in its own right. So I want everyone to pay attention right now, because even if you haven't got this stuff wrong, I think there's a greater chance moving forwards that tenants might try and pull these sorts of stunts on us just to frustrate matters. And at the end of the day, we're footing the bill. I've got, a court letter here, and, this particular case is going to court, and this lady will ultimately pay the rent that she's due, but there'll be a demand, but we'll probably never get the money from her now because the arrears are just so substantial. So I think this is a really serious problem. And I think that, yes, first of all, making sure that we do the right things with the properties is incredibly important, but also making sure that that defensibility is very clear, very black and white. So talk to us, guys, about some of the technical things in areas of perhaps defensibility, compliance, paperwork, certificates that you think we should be paying better attention to from the outset. And then if it's okay, I'd really like to actually get some technical examples from you, if it is ventilation, if it is heating. And I suppose we've also got minimum energy efficiency standards. Yes, it's been pushed back to 2030, but things like that are changing. So just give me your thoughts and ideas and opinions as to what these technical things we should be paying more attention to right now are.
Absolutely. So it's really important, as Andrew said, all landlords or lots of great landlords, especially within this community, are trying to make fantastic products. And those products get lost if there isn't documentation to support those. And exactly what you said, Andy, if you didn't have the documentation to prove that your building was built very well and everything was in line and in check, then they might have actually won the court case. So we like to believe that from the beginning, these documentations need to be put in place. So what we tend to do with our clients is all the drawings, plans, building regs, details, etc., that we create have all the right specifications and integrated within it. So when they're creating a new external wall or when they're refurbing an existing wall, do they need to put insulation in? What's the buildup of the current wall? What's going on in there? And that documentation then enables you and your builder to work on site really well, understand that everything's getting built really well. And then on site, it's a really good idea to actually document that as well, to have kind of proof that you've actually built things the way that you say you've built with all the kind of standards and everything in place. And I think just kind of going to the nitty gritty of things, we know that landlords through the Renters' Right Bill will have to add their names to a scheme that's coming through. There's new legislations that have come in to say that any house with damp and mold, etc., needs to be investigated. So things like that, it's really important to have the right documentation to say that what you're doing and you're doing things well. So in terms of kind of lead detailing a property, need to know how the walls are working. Is there enough insulation in it? Like you say, the EPC, new EPCs coming through as well, to understand whether if you're creating ground floor spaces, basement spaces, have they been tanked correctly? How does that work? Is there a pump there, etc.? So we can get into a whole whole detail of everything and how it can work well. But at the end of the day, you're really making sure that these buildings are built robust. It doesn't just work for either 1 year, 2 year. There's actually a longevity within the project that you're creating. So you don't have to go back really often and have to do remedial works to ensure that the tenants are happy, and you have tenants that are happy to reside there and they don't complain about due to environmental health.
I think this is really good advice, and I think it's also important to remember that it's very exciting doing, your first or second or third HMO project, but the hard work is actually in making that asset work
Yeah.
for 10, 15, 20 years time. And I think that that's often overlooked by a lot of investors coming into the industry. And it can be a huge burden if you don't think about this stuff from the outset. Now, I think, to be honest, we are talking here about certainly planning better from the outset if we are going to do any works. But I think for a lot of people, and this is a narrative I've been pushing for a long, long time, but trying to cobble together sketch drawings overlaid on, some right move floor plan with like some building control detail to give you your contract. That is not the right way to do it. Yes, it might be cheap. Yes, it might be faster, but you've got to think about the long term. Long term, you've got very little defensibility if you have some issues. There's a very good chance that you may not have done it right. And from experience, and we've talked about this on the show several times, when it comes to things like M&E drawings and regularized drawings, if you've not got the proper spec with elevations or all your bits and pieces, it usually just comes back to bite you in the form of additional costs from contractors, because there's this big grey area between what you thought and what they thought the expectations were on the project. So I think that this is about following a better process from the outset. And yes, we're focusing on a couple of things today because of the new legislation coming in. I mean, AWAB's law, damp, mould, condensation. We know that naturally speaking, this is a challenge in HMOs. Anyway, you've got a lot of people living, breathing, cooking, using water, boiling water, all of that stuff. And it does create a lot of humidity in the environment. Yeah. And that can lead to problems. But I think that, thinking about this from the outset is more important than ever. What I'd like to do is focus on these two elements, and let's focus on energy efficiency or sort of heating solutions, and let's focus on ventilation. I mean, Andrew, I'll ping it over to you. Where do you want to start on these two enthralling topics?
But now let's go on. Let's start on insulation. So I think just to a little bit remember what Mary's been saying as well, and as you're saying, Andy, as you know, when you're working with building control, for example, you've got to have that drawing that says what you're going to do, how it's going to be done, how it's going to be built. That's point number one. But then you also need to document that, how it's been done on site, and that's your photographs. Might even need to be photographs of a tape measure to demonstrate the thickness of the insulation. And I think that needs to be going to another step further and not just being something that's done by building control, checking it. You need to have that own record for yourselves. That's the level of detail you need to go into the drawing and then the evidence on site. Because once that wall's plastered, painted, who knows what colour plasterboard's been used underneath there, if it's for fire rating and whatnot, who knows what insulation's in that wall, what thickness it is, etc. Something that does fall between the gaps a little bit with building control as well is thermal insulation of properties, especially if you're doing something small, like a small HMO, where it might already be a C3 house, typical residential house. You're turning it to a C4 HMO, so something up to 6 beds, which doesn't really trigger a great deal in building control requirements, like it does when you go into bigger sui generis HMOs. And so there can often not be a need for you to upgrade thermal elements, etc. And it can come down to your personal choice as the landlord. And we'd be kind of imploring you to be really considering that, as we've alluded to with the energy efficiency side of things with EPCs. Yes, again, like you said, it's been delayed. But at some point that is going to come in, and that could be a potential large cost if refurbishment works, if you're upgrading external walls with insulation, especially do it internally. And so I'd just be maybe considering it more from just an EPC point of view, but also as we've started to talk about the new renters' right stuff coming in and cold houses, damp is often caused through the lack of insulation on the walls because of the differential in temperature between the inside of the space and the outside of the space and the surface. And so thinking about things like that, whether you do external insulation and re-render the outside of the property, or you internally insulate inside the walls, I definitely think it's something that should be getting considered as part of your refurb cost and not just seen as a unnecessary expense that maybe doesn't visually sell to the potential tenants.
Yeah, agreed.
And I think, just so our listeners who perhaps don't have the experience of doing this, the difference between something like internal and external insulation systems, actually, they're both in practice quite similar. There's a frame that you might fit to the wall, either internally or externally, fit the insulation to it, and then you've got your finished wall covering on. A little bit easier to do inside because obviously you don't need scaffold and you've not got the elements to contend with, but obviously you do lose an element of space inside. Andrew, just let's take a specific example. Let's sort of assume like an old-ish house. I think it would probably be fair to say that most people, the average buyer investor, probably wouldn't really be that clued up in terms of what the cavity might be made up of, what the sort of thermal composition of a particular house that they're buying might be. So would you recommend that we should be starting with some sort of an energies sort of survey, getting a consultant's opinion and review of the house? Because I've done this sort of stuff many times on larger schemes, but I'll be honest, I'm thinking about this stuff more now, as you guys are. But it's not something I really ever did with the HMOs. But, what's your opinion now? Is this something that we should all be doing to almost give us that baseline, better understanding of what we're starting with?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there's varying levels of it, but I mean, again, in residential properties, including HMOs, you're going to need an EPC at the end of it. And we always get our EPC assessor out to visit the property as soon as we start the works. We get them to do a model on the current property and what its current rating is and what it would achieve if we were to do certain different aspects of work to it. So external wall insulation, loft insulation, insulation underneath the suspended floor if there is one, increased new boilers, radiators with TRVs, etc., and understand the different things that can be done and how they will impact it all the way through to, things like solar panels. So I think, that as a bare minimum. I think the EPC assessment costs have gone up slightly because of the way that it's changed, but, that's a sub £100 activity, and that can give you a whole host of information and knowledge about what's necessary. As you said, the UK, a lot of our housing stock is, 100 years old, and it's not designed for necessarily modern living, especially not designed for HMO living, all these people under one roof, like you talked about before, with creating moisture in the air and so many bodies in one space. You've had an amazing stat last year when we were having some issues with some students and damp and condensation in some of the properties about how much moisture we just release through breathing every day.
2 cups of water a day in
Yeah.
a room.
And, where is that going? We've not gone to ventilation yet, but where is that going? So yeah, I think it's, as a bare minimum, it's important to do that and understand that these houses weren't designed for this kind of living. They generally don't have any insulation in the walls because that wasn't the thing that you did 100 years ago. And so that there's going to need to be some form of improvement to fabric in order to help improve the livability of that property.
And this example that you gave, an EPC assessor, for example, will they do a cavity inspection? Or is that something that, we need to get maybe separately? Because you don't always know what's in the cavity, do you?
No, not at all. We're currently renovating our own home, and I was amazed to find out we had insulation in the wall. Like, I wouldn't have expected it. I did not expect it to be there at all with the age of the property. So no, an EPC assessor is not likely to do that. The best way to do it is to be a builder and ask them to, drill a hole through the wall, and then you can usually get a gauge of how thick each skin of the wall might be, if there's a cavity, what might be in the cavity, etc.
Yeah.
But that's the best way to investigate that.
And if you didn't have any, obviously there are solutions to filling cavities. If you've got some, then great. You've got something that at least you can start to base some calculations from, and you might need more or less internal, external insulation if that's what you decide to do. I think it's fair to say as well that the topic of energy and energy efficiency is quite broad, and it can get very, very complicated very, very quickly. And I think that that's one of the things that a lot of landlords and investors can get overwhelmed with. I've seen this and experienced it myself. But if you are converting to a new build, then the regulations are much stricter, so you become much more familiar with the sort of requirements. But it can be very, very complicated, and your heating solution can all impact this as well, and the efficiency of that. And now we're talking more about things like PV, which is for solar, for anyone who doesn't know, plus or minus batteries. There's what they called, the other different types of boilers and
SOS heat pumps and now
SOS heat pumps. So exactly correct. Yeah. So there's lots of different stuff, but let's just put that aside for a minute and keep this simple. So obviously assessing the cavity is a sensible idea. Getting an EPC assessor to come and give us an idea of where we're at now versus where we can get to is going to be a really great guide on then what we need to provide you guys with in terms of onward design. So let's assume that we've been able to get to an answer and you guys have been able to design something sensible into a scheme for us. Let's talk about ventilation, because interestingly, a lot of what we're required to do as HMO operators, like have fire doors, have all these sealed, actually it's very, very bad for ventilation. So ironically, it's a problem on suites, more and more popular to have lots of en suites, every bedroom, it's got an ensuite these days. That's a lot of moisture and, the opportunity for things to get trapped. So let's talk about ventilation systems for a second then. And just for everybody listening, I would say that this is almost impossible to avoid entirely. Like in my experience, it's so hard, and I'll fall on this sword, but it's so much of it is still down to tenants and tenant behavior. And so the communication element, the education element is still absolutely massive. But if you've been able to do that, you're able to demonstrate it, plus you've been able to demonstrate what you've installed, which is what we're talking about here today, that's a great and very defensible position. And if you do get a very difficult tenant that makes your life a hell, then you've got all this information and evidence. But tell us from a ventilation perspective then, guys, what are the sorts of problems that we're having? And most importantly, what solutions specifically for HMOs should we be thinking about more now?
Yeah, no worries. As we all know, the UK is a very damp country. Unfortunately. So, as you mentioned, we need to consider different ventilation options. And as we know, most of our tenants, they just send us a message saying, I've got mold in my room's damp. And as much as we say you need to open your windows, even though it's cold, to let the air transfer, etc., that might not always work and might not always be the case. So we kind of have different types of ventilation systems that you can use within the house to allow a domestic house to be well ventilated. One is trickle vent, which people know quite well, and the other one is passive ventilation. And that's just kind of in bedrooms. So trickle vent comes in most of double glazing, and it allows for air transfer to move through from outside and inside, and stops condensation building in a cold area, which is the windows. So that's really important. So if you're not changing the windows or the double glazing in the house, in the rooms, it's really important to understand that those triple vents work really well and they work efficiently. The second thing is passive ventilation and passive vents. So a lot of basement rooms. So a lot of us, we convert houses into HMOs. There's basement areas, or we convert the basement, and those basements are particularly damp. And so one of the really good ideas to go in terms of ventilation, those areas where you get particularly, so the transfer of cold air from the soil outside is quite dense to the warmth that's inside, so you get damp and mold build up quite quickly. So passive vents are very, very simple. You can install them on the outside wall of a basement or upper floors, anywhere that's particularly damp. They're like, so you car hole drill, just like a vent that you would put into a bathroom, and they passively move air in and out of a room. And that's a really nice way to ventilate a space. We've got it in historical houses where you've got this mesh. But that mesh isn't as kind of high tech as what we can find now. Now you can find systems where the air kind of comes in and out, but it gets blocked, so it doesn't actually get loads of cold air coming from outside. It actually monitors the air that comes in and out with very simple technology that they've got integrated in them. So that's kind of bedroom venting.
One of the systems that I've used for years, sort of about 15 years, is by a company called Nuair. And they have positive and I think negative systems. And I think that depending on the environment and where they're placed, they do a slightly different thing. And they will assess the situation for you and tell you and be able to recommend what would be best. One of the challenges I have found in the past is that because of the fire doors that we typically have in HMOs, there are certain challenges, but there are some very specific. So just to be clear as well, we're not necessarily just talking about a single fan or a single ventilation system in a room. You can actually get these intelligently designed solutions, often that actually the actual unit might be placed in a loft environment or something like that, and they can operate across the whole house. They cost a few quid, but I found that these are very, very good. You don't necessarily do the full job, but they are very, very good. I mean, let's talk about bathrooms, Mary, wet environments. What would your recommendation be there for HMO landlords and investors?
So there's two different things. The normal one that is probably best for en suites is the kind of the timer ventilations that you can get, the extractor fans. So you can set them to a 15-minute, 10-minute, half an hour ventilation. Because it's inside someone's room, they don't actually like hearing that go off a lot. Sometimes you can go into your HMOs and they've switched them off.
Sometimes, I mean, almost every time they've switched it off, let's be honest.
Because they're
It's
not
ve
happy with that.
I know, and it's a very again, that's why inspecting is so important, like, little things like that. I've got damp in my mould. Well, yeah, because you have had the fan turned off, and that's been the case every time we've been inspected. But sorry, I interrupt. Get off my soapbox.
Absolutely. So yeah, timer ventilations are very good for en suite. and there's a level of kind of control over it. In general bathrooms that aren't too close to bedrooms, and then in where you've got washing machines and dryers and things like that, humidity extractor fans are really good. So they can basically assess, they have a sensor in them, they can assess when the humidity is high and
Yeah.
at a certain level, and then they'll just stay on until the humidity drops. And that's really helpful, and it can save a lot of mold and damp headache.
Yeah, I agree completely with that. I think it's also worth saying that there are lots of different products on the market, and you tend to get what you pay for. So if you want a high powered and more reliable unit, and potentially a unit that's quieter, that tenants are less likely to turn off, you might spend more. But in the context of this conversation, think about whether or not that might be a sensible investment. Probably, if you want to avoid replacing it or having issues, it probably is the sort of thing you want to spend a few more quid on. Another thing that I would just point out is that ventilating bathrooms to the external can be a bit of a challenge with so many en suites in houses. We know that unless there's a clear run or you just happen to be going out in the same direction as joist, it can be a bit of a challenge. Sometimes dropping a ceiling is a solution, but irrespective, what I would recommend is that where possible, put a rigid ducting system in, because it just maintains much greater pressure than a flexible ducting system. So this guy's just, if you're not quite sure what I'm talking about, between, let's say, the fan in the ceiling above the shower and then the external wall where it's actually vented out, that distance between, you could use a flexible ducting system, which you'll have almost certainly seen. And it's good because it can get around awkward spaces a bit better, but typically speaking, that pressure that it's able to maintain just isn't as high, so it doesn't extract as well. If you get a rigid system out there, it's much, much better, and you're going to get better performance. And documenting all of this, just having the photographs, the evidence, the information about the systems that you've used, all great if/when you do have problems with these sorts of things. And I think, just again, so all of our listeners understand, if you've got 5, 6 en suites, and you need ventilation to every room, and you need ventilation from every bathroom, and you want it done in a particular way, this is the sort of information that's very easily lost in translation. You know, your expectations are misaligned, and you end up overpaying for lots of work because your contractor just, hadn't priced it in. If you're working with Andrew Mary, this sort of stuff as part of your M&E design will all be considered, and then that information can be given straight to your contractor so you can get it priced and the job done on that basis. And then you've got part of that information to support or form part of your pack for future sort of documentation and evidence if you ever need it. Thanks, guys. I think that this stuff is really important. They are kind of boring subjects, let's be honest, but really important. I think if we want to get this right and we want to spend less in the long term and also keep tenants happier, this is important. Now, that brings me really nicely onto a couple of other things that I want to discuss today. Let's just jump straight to adaptability and trying to push for longer tenancies. We know that with the new legislation, tenants can leave effectively after month 2. Not great. And we want to make sure that this isn't happening, because tenants who leave, it's just going to cost us money. So talk to us about adaptability and long-term solutions to try and promote and encourage longer tenancies. And I think, by the way, that better heating solutions, fewer damp, mold, condensation issues, they are a great starting point. But what other ideas could you share with us, guys?
Yeah, so in terms of adaptability, we're obviously creating mainly HMOs. The occupants are solely responsible for their rooms, and they occupy their rooms quite often. So it's really important for us to understand how these rooms can be adaptable. The size of these rooms is critical. People want to feel like they can personalize the space. They might want to move the furniture around, make it more adaptable, introduce maybe their own desks, etc. So now is the time for us to really think hard about what does it mean to design these spaces, and what does it mean to be able to give the tenants enough flexibility for them to call those spaces their own homes, to make it personal to themselves. So design really comes hand in hand with that. And then on top of that, as part of the designing those spaces, it's really important to get the storage just right. And we bang on about this quite often, is that These tenants, again, they've mainly got this room. They can't store things outside of this room. So maximizing storage under beds, big wardrobes, desk space storage, any other kind of storage that they can have is ideal to maximize and consider within the room.
We like to think that we're architects and we know the best way to lay out a room, but you wouldn't believe the amount of times we've got into our rooms and, HMOs, and the tenants completely switched all the furniture around, and, the wardrobe's at the end of the bed, and you're thinking, like, how does that even function? It's in the middle of the room, and, like, both people want to change things, and people live in different ways, don't they? So having that ability for it to be tweaked, I think, is a big plus point to potential tenants.
Yeah, and I think that if you're not a designer, and most of us aren't designers, it's really easy to overlook how a space can potentially function the best in terms of circulation space, but also using otherwise perhaps non-functional wall space. It really does determine, where ideally the bed might go, or, where other furniture runs might go and things like that. And it does need to be planned in from the outset. How many times have we seen people design rooms and, the project looks great, but by the time they put the furniture in there, all the sockets and switches and everything's just kind of in the wrong place, and actually the room doesn't really work. And then the tenants inevitably come in and then change things around themselves as well. So I think that again, something that should be thought about at the outset. It can be designed into your scheme. You tell the contractor exactly where each switch and socket is going to go, because the bed and the desk and the wardrobe and the chairs, and they're all going to go in these sorts of positions. But I think any reason we give for a tenant to leave is a detriment to our business now. And I think that we're all so focused on trying to make our HMOs look as best as they possibly could do, because we want to hit that target on the spreadsheet and we want to get it, to 100% occupancy as quickly as possible. But please don't forget, guys, that what we really want to be aiming for is keeping that property full for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And it's this really granular detail that is just so often overlooked. And actually, it doesn't take much more time to really think about it. Might cost a few more quid, but it'll save you so much in the long term. Let me get your opinion on one thing in particular, because this popped up in my inbox this week. Pets in HMOs. Just, Jim, we know that there's a change to the legislation. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a requirement in HMOs, but I just want to get your personal opinion on this. How do you guys feel if a tenant asks you if they can have a pet?
We've had it already in the past, even before this legislation changed. Dogs, we had illegal cats in a HMO that we
Keep going.
It was very cheery, but we both threatened we had to ask the tenant to. Well, it was either the cat or the tenant. The tenant went with the cat. So we've already had it, and we're not anti-pets in general, but unfortunately, I just don't think that they can and will ever work in HMOs. You're banking on, obviously, even at the outset, where if everyone's on board with that potential tenant having a pet, you've got to then think about the future changeover and then the future tenants that you might be moving in. Allergies, for example, could be a big thing, and that could stop potential tenants or limit your potential tenants moving in. So I'm not sure pets in HMOs will actually ever happen. I think there'll be enough grounds to be able to refuse a pet at a HMO, but it's still gonna, even if you're just moving away. I know we focus on HMOs, but if you're designing blocks of flats buy to let, it's something that you are going to need to start considering, and maybe start thinking about your finishes. Do you have a lot more hard flooring around the property? What paint are you putting on the walls? Something that's durable or wipe clean, easily wiped clean, and then potentially more storage even needed for these pets and on their apparatus. Where's the cage going to go in the room? Are we going to go to this level of detail of figuring out where the dog's bed might go? It's going to add a whole another level of thought process.
Yeah, again, I think it just reiterates, doesn't it, that we need to think more from the outset. I agree with you, especially when it comes to professional HMOs. I don't think pets really work, because one person changes, you've got to fill that room, and actually there might be issues or allergies or problems, whatever. I will say that in my student HMOs, on a case-by-case basis, I let them, and I have found that I've been able to maintain really great relationships with some of my tenants because of that. Now, I will add that a lot of my tenants study veterinary medicine, so they are quite animal-orientated people.
Yeah.
But I will also say that on one occasion, I let somebody do it, And she promised me the dog was really behaved, and the dog ate half the sofa. And I had to call Dale at Landlord Furniture Co. and ask him for a new sofa. I also had another tenant who had, and again, so I do it on a case-by-case basis, but she had been a difficult tenant for a few reasons, not something I often experience with students. Fallen out with a housemates, that kind of thing, and insisted that she needed a therapy dog. And, that's difficult because obviously, where tenants, maybe feel like they're struggling, would find benefit from having certain things. You want to try and oblige where you can, but my gut instinct was that, I don't think this tenant and a pet is a good combination. I think it's going to make a bad situation or worse. This particular tenant proceeded to get a Belgian Malinois, which, for anyone who doesn't know, is like a police dog. Not great for a student to bring a puppy Belgian Malinois home, who, yes, proceeded to eat the stairs, which was not cool. And, obviously, in the end, that dog had to leave, and it caused a big upheaval. But I think on a case-by-case basis in student HMOs, it can work well if you've got a good relationship with tenants. But you've got to be really careful. But I completely agree. Buy-to-lets, blocks of flats, those sorts of things. Now we do need to be, thinking more about durability, the types of materials, the space, functionality, and that sort of thing. Okay, let's talk about just good positioning in general. I think just on this topic of trying to keep tenants happier, trying to reduce the risk that tenants feel like for whatever reason they want to move somewhere, find alternative or better accommodation. What other things do you think we should be paying more and more attention to, guys?
I think a lot of the small, like just the things that you think are quite minor now, and a tenant is likely to put up with because of the fact that they're in a fixed term tenancy, they're the bits that I think are going to become more in the forefront of everyone's mind because they have the ability to leave and within 2 months and or almost immediately after moving in. And that could be small items like, I don't know, the light in the bathroom flickers or something, or it could be relationships and interactions with other tenants. We have a HMO that has a constant battle about the mess in the communal area. We've ended up, after being told by everyone in the house that nothing belonged to them, we then emptied all the belongings that were in the living room. And literally within 30 minutes, we had 2 emails from tenants telling us that we'd removed their stuff. And it's like, we've also got emails from you telling us that none of the stuff in there is yours. You know what I mean? Like, which one is it? But, if tenants are being messy, they're leaving bikes in the lounge or, suitcases on the shelves in the communal area. Little things like that people might just be like, well, you know what? I can leave in 2 months and I can't be bothered with this. So I think there's design elements, keeping on top of maintenance elements. And then there's also just through inspections and trying to maintain and ensure that the actions of the other tenants are also not going to cause friction with other people.
I agree. I think some good policies about certain things. I think no bikes in hallways is great. Very easy to justify, from a fire risk perspective. A little tip, and, rightly or wrongly, I've found over the years that it's not a great idea to provide storage solutions in communal spaces because they tend to get used for clutter and junk. Side tables, drawers, just the extra fridge that you don't want to throw away that gets banged, under the stairs. I've seen it all a million times. Shelves, just not great, I think, in communal spaces, and it gets very difficult for cleaners. We've all seen it happen with the mail just piles up on that coffee table just down the side of the sofa that nobody really uses. It's just a dumping zone. So I think that, really good, sensible storage solutions in private zones, and then very sort of carefully selected, I think, in communal spaces where it kind of really well thought is a sensible idea. And I think, we talked about this before we hit record, just more thoughtful design. I know a lot of us are doing that, but there are still people who design is a kind of an afterthought. I mean, what tips, Mary, would you share or recommend when it comes to sort of better and more thoughtful design?
I think it's important to get into the mindset of the tenants, or you as the tenants are coming through the spaces and understanding actually how do you want the lighting in your spaces to feel light and bright and airy, so it doesn't feel, just as a space itself, it doesn't feel cluttered, it doesn't feel overwhelming, it doesn't feel dense. They come at the end of the day when they're quite tired, so they want spaces they can feel comfortable in, they can feel like they can kind of breathe out in. And then again, like we said, when entering your bedroom, if you maximize storage solution within the bedroom, it means that the spaces are left without clutter. And that really helps someone's kind of mental state and the way they are. And that really helps them to use the space really well. Having desk space, please, everybody, even if the room's small, have desk spaces. Lots of people work from home. So it's really important to orientate these bedroom areas. So you've got, even though it's a small space, they've got a nice relaxing space for your bed. You've got a space that you get changed in. You've got a space that you can work in, and then a little zone that you can put your mats out and do yoga or pray. I think considering something like that and getting into the mindset of the tenants are really important.
Mm. We're planning a scheme at the minute, and granted, it's a slightly larger than the average HMO. It's more sort of in the region of 50 to 60 rooms, but it's great fun because it really forces you to think about the other amenities and thoughtful use of space in a way that perhaps you're not necessarily forced to do when it comes to a HMO. On larger schemes, the council is actually going to scrutinise these other elements of shared amenity more so than smaller private HMOs. But I think we can take those principles and apply them to anything now. I think this has been a really interesting conversation, guys. And the theme on the podcast this year so far has largely been about the change in direction of the sector for us, the fact that standards are changing, that there is going to be more pressure on landlords, and we do need to be mindful. I think that complacency, this year will come at a very big cost, a cost that some landlords will find that they actually just cannot shoulder. But I think that if you're doing new projects, if you're going back and revisiting projects, or you're planning for the future, as some projects and some houses, and I've got these myself in my own portfolio, as they come up for some natural, let's say rejuvenation, I think that these sorts of things, are exactly what we should all be considering. But future proofing, please, everybody listening today, remember that the spreadsheet is only telling you what it's going to perform like today. It tells you nothing about where you're likely to be in 5, 10, 15 years' time. And we haven't even touched on OPEX and trying to keep costs down as we manage things moving forwards. Perhaps another episode. But guys, a great conversation as always. It's always so useful to get your professional insights, and you have this really unique view on the whole of the market because you work with so many people on HMO projects, so you see so much more than the average investor. So for anybody listening today, if you're doing another project, if you're revisiting a project, please go and have a conversation with Andrew and Mary. They can do everything for you. Optimization just from the outset. When you're thinking about buying something, they can do all of your full plans, regularized drawings, all your M&E stuff. Andrew has volunteered to give you personal advice on ventilation and heating. That's obviously a joke. Please don't call Andrew about ventilation and heating. But in all seriousness, take this stuff seriously. If you want to go and catch up with Andrew and Mary, drop an inquiry and have a conversation with them about how they might be able to help you on a particular project, just head to the hmoroadmap.co.uk, find our services page, and you'll find a drop down for Andrew and Mary in their architectural service. But guys, as always, a huge pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for all of your insights. They help us to no end. And I'm sure that many people listening today will be about to kind of drop you an inquiry because they need your services. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, as always.
Andy.